It's my pleasure to introduce the panel conversation, Addressing the Eviction Crisis, Strategies to Keep Tenants in Their Homes. Even as the rental market softens in 2024, rents remain higher than they were before the pandemic. 3 out of every 4 low-income households in Texas lack access to affordable housing. Many renters are cost-burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing and hampering their ability to pay for other critical needs like transportation and childcare. As more individuals and families with kids in our community face the risk of eviction, support systems like eviction prevention programs and effective rental assistance are becoming more important than ever. This panel will explore potential solutions to these issues, such as developing tailored eviction prevention plans, tracking data on rental housing to assist policymakers and tenants in decision-making, and working with tenants to directly improve their living conditions. So I'm really pleased that this session is going to be moderated by my colleague, João Connolly, who many of us know as JP. JP currently serves, all right. JP currently serves on the board of directors of HousingWorks Austin. He previously served as organizing director for the Austin Justice Coalition, co-chair of the ATX Leadership Council, and as a member of both the City of Austin Planning Commission and the Community Advisory Committee for Project Connect. In recent years, JP's advocacy and mobilizing efforts have focused on building community power for housing and mobility justice. With the Austin Justice Coalition, he worked to build power for local tenants and core transit users, advocating for permanent supportive and low barrier housing, and organizing within the homeless response system to build a system that's more effective, coordinated, and responsive to the needs of every person experiencing homelessness in our community. So as y'all know, I mean, in Austin, we like to think of ourselves as a very progressive place, right? And what I really appreciate about a JP is that he's a truth teller, and he's not afraid to point out when maybe we're not living up to all of our ideals, right? So please join me in welcoming João Connolly.
So I'm excited to be here to have this conversation. And sometimes I've been known as a little bit of a troublemaker around this town. But I promised Yves I would be on my best behavior today to moderate this panel for y'all. And I'm really excited for the folks that we have, that we've brought here to have this conversation. And so first I want to introduce Andrew Kieve, who is the co-founder of Tolemi and is an expert on data collection around rental properties, evictions, and other things of that sort. And I'd like to welcome Andrew Kieve to the stage. I'm also excited to be joined by a dear friend and colleague, Shoshana Krieger, who is the executive director, the project director, and founder of BASTA, Building and Strengthening Tenant Action, here in Austin. Shoshana has been doing amazing work in our community to build tenant power and to speak for and build power with folks that are that deal with many of these pressures and displacement pressures and eviction pressures in our community. And I also want to introduce Matt Pritchard from HomeStart, the executive director of HomeStart, who has a tremendous amount of expertise both in the field of eviction prevention and deeply affordable housing in Boston, and we're really excited to have him here with us today. Before we jump into this conversation, I wanted us to take a moment and watch a very short video clip that was filmed of some tenants in Austin sort of expressing some of the pressures, some of the difficulties and challenges they face and the experiences they're going through. And the reason we want to take a moment to watch this clip is just because it can help ground us in the fact that whenever we're having these conversations, we might be talking about policies, we might be talking about data and systems, but we're always also talking about people and real lives, and lives that often have limited choices within the current structures and systems that we have. And so thinking about why this matters to us so much locally in our community, evictions have now returned to the levels they were at before the COVID pandemic, and in some cases have begun to actually exceed the pre-pandemic averages. And my whole life in Austin, this is very personal for me because I have always been a renter for my entire life. And I know what a lot of those pressures feel like on a very personal level. So when we talk about building tenant power, this matters to me, matters to my family and folks that are near to me, but it also matters to all of us here as a community. So I wanted to, if we have that clip on hand, we'll take a second to just watch a minute or two of listen to some local tenants.
Viendo en esta propiedad, acabo de recibir el aviso para renovar mi contrato de $8.68 que pagaba yo. Ahora mi renta subió a $1,257, un aumento de $400 que en verdad no puedo pagar. Es el 50% de aumento, es mucho.
I'm having problems with my rent because they keep, it was like $8.78, now it's $9.22. And they're just not, I've had so many different things that they've had to work on, and this reconstruction, whatever.
Yo viví muchos años aquí porque la renta era módica, pero ahora, aparte de ser muy alta, la propiedad tiene muchos problemas de mantenimiento, de seguridad, de limpieza, problemas con los contratos.
Since I've had COVID, it's just been very hard for me. And I've also, this is not the only bill I have, of course. I have a lot of women that have medicine bills. And it just doesn't make sense for me. I mean, that we only on a set income. And I can't afford to work a certain job. Another job.
Quizás hay apartamentos mejores, pero hay un problema. Hay que pagar depósito de luz nuevamente, el depósito de la renta. Si no tienes un vehículo en que mover tus cosas, tienes que pagar mudanza.
Try to find a solution, help us find a solution to stay, because we're too old to move. Having a hard time, we're having a hard time going back and forth when they was renovating apartments.
Yo no estoy en capacidad de pagar una renta yo sola. Tengo que pedir ayuda de mis hijos o irme a vivir con alguno de mis hijos porque no manejo, y me ha gustado siempre esta área por la comodidad del autobús.
We try to live on what we have.
On what we have, and it's not, it goes up, but it only go up to a certain amount, and you still stuck with the rent. The rent's going higher than your check that we get every month.
And we're all trying to help each other live,
Right.
do what we can to help everybody
Help
live.
right.
Hay muchos desalojos, hay mucha gente que se va por su cuenta por lo mismo.
So with that grounding and thinking about the real lives that we're discussing here, my first question for all three of you is, how does your work address the eviction crisis that our communities are facing? What strategies do you employ to help keep tenants in their homes? Andrew? Do you
Sure,
want?
I'll start. So we don't work directly with tenants, we don't work directly with housers. We work with local governments who are focused on ensuring safe and stable housing. We try to deploy a data platform that enables local governments, cities mostly, to be more proactive, more strategic, and more intentional about housing interventions. Our goal is to move folks in the public sector from being responsive and reactive to being more proactive, and we think data can play a huge role in that. We do that in a couple different ways. One, broadly speaking, is through oversight, right? It could be something as practical as oversight of rental registration, licensing, or inspection programs. So helping ensure they strike a balance between providing adequate oversight on in housing, but also ensuring that the landlord community is heard from in those arrangements. All the way up to healthy homes or lead inspection programs as well. But making sure everything is done with a backbone or a basis of using data to be smart about administering those programs. It's also about oversight of at-risk tenants, right? So pulling in data that helps identify both the acute indicators of displacement, so like an eviction filing, a foreclosure filing, as well as some of the more upstream indicators. Looking at things like folks that are falling behind on taxes, that are starting to see neighborhood change coupled with financial instability. We found that really enables local governments to be more proactive in the interventions and tools they have at their disposal. Also tracking behavior of landlords. It's important to note that a very small subset of landlords represent a very outsized portion of the problematic landlords in every community that we work in. But ensuring that cities can shine a light on those bad actors, the folks that are investing in substandard, that are buying substandard properties, not investing them, and basically milking those assets down, shielding themselves through LLCs. So we work closely with city legal departments and code enforcement to be more proactive and not waiting for complaints to come in, because we know that a complaint-based system of code enforcement ensuring safe and stable property standards is inherent with implicit and explicit bias. But then also zooming out, we try to give communities a better understanding of where housing, and specifically rental housing markets, are changing by tracking indicators of upcoming displacement. So like, where do you see large institutional investors starting to invest in communities? Where do you see owner occupants selling? Where do you see small scale local landlords being pinched because tenants are forced to make a decision between paying their grocery bills and paying their rent? And so we think data can shine a light and allow communities to be a lot more proactive. The other piece that we do is around prevention. So again, looking at those acute indicators of displacement, looking at those acute indicators of displacement, but also allowing communities to focus on, preservation is what I meant to say, allowing them to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing. A lot of communities that we start working with are sort of operating a little bit blind in terms of understanding where is my rental housing stock, what are the dynamics of my owners, and data can actually play a great role in helping cities understand where is my naturally occurring affordable housing, where are my local landlords at risk of being bought out by maybe some not great actors. And so that preservation piece really plays a key role in the upstream eviction prevention.
That's wonderful. Shoshana.
Oh, okay. So first, it's lovely to be here today in this room with all of y'all. BASTA is privileged to work with a lot of folks in this room. So I'm Shoshana Krieger. I, as JP said, work at BASTA, Building and Strengthening Tenant Action, or Buscando Acción y Solidaridad que Transforme el Arrendamiento. I have a lot of my team here today. Woo woo. And we work to build tenant power in Austin. And that by bringing underrepresented Austin renters into a housing justice movement that's fueled by tenant-led organizing, outreach, and community education. And the way in which I think all of our work in some ways addresses evictions, because at the end of the day, eviction is the root of all landlord power. It shapes every aspect of the landlord-tenant relationship. Tenants don't ask for repairs because they're afraid they're going to be evicted. Tenants put up with bullying managers because they're afraid they're going to be evicted. They don't stand up for their rights. They don't organize with their neighbors because their manager threatens to call the cops or calls the cops on them, right? And then that all could be tied back to, oh, I might be evicted because the cops were called. So eroding that root of landlord power, the eviction, is building tenant power. And so we do that in a number of ways, and we could kind of think about some of our interventions, both downstream and upstream. And the downstream interventions that BASTA engages in is largely through our eviction mitigation team, which is doing a tremendous amount of work on the front lines, responding and providing resources to tenants who've received eviction filings. So we get information from the courts, contact information of tenants, and we text, email, and call tenants who we know have eviction filings. There's a monthly volunteer call clinic if anyone wants to join. And we have a resource guide which connects tenants with resources which are available. Part of that that outreach is specifically focused on tenants who live in properties which have special protections from the CARES Act, where they should be getting additional notice. So we also are thinking through strategically how are we providing those downstream resources in the most effective way possible. We also flyer at properties which we know have the highest number of evictions. As Andrew, you said, we see a disproportionate number of filings at very specific properties. Also in our organizing work, we organize tenants in multifamily properties and mobile home parks. And in that organizing work, sometimes that organizing starts because of a massive wave of lease termination. So for example, a lot of people in this room will know Rosemont at Oak Valley. The Housing Authority of Travis County staff and the management company a few years ago decided to try to evict 87 families and terminate their leases. And the neighbors at Rosemont Tenants Association came together, and we had the privilege of supporting them and fighting back, and they were able to stop all of those lease terminations. And then that ended up transitioning into some upstream interventions that we did. That neighbors at Rosemont ended up going to the county commissioner's court and saying, hey, we need additional tenant protections like some tenants in city-owned properties have, and these should be in our leases. And the commissioner's court required that those protections be put into those tenants' leases. Now, the implementation was shaky. Housing Authority of Travis County staff did everything they could not to do it. Luckily, Strategic Housing Finance Corporation now was able to break from HATC, and we actually have the first projects with that implemented, right? And so that is, we have to look at both. We can't just look at one or the other. And then the final way, which I would say that we're working on evictions, is through data. And data kind of combines both upstream and downstream, right? Because data gives us what's happening right now, but then we can learn from the data to be able to craft the most effective solutions. And so we have been using court data and working with court data for some time. And next week we'll be putting out a report on evictions based upon 2022 and 2023 data. There's a QR code, which I think will be up at some point.
We'll pull up the QR code
yes.
at the end.
And it's not officially released, but you can get a sneak peek there. And that also has a dashboard where you yourself can play around to see where are evictions happening by census tract and location. And Pei-Shi Chang, who's sitting right there and is super modest, is our data guy who really made all of that happen. And so we hope that that can be a resource for this community for us to be thinking through how do we innovate and create effective interventions.
Matt, you want to share with us a little bit?
Sure, thanks. I just want to, again, thank you for giving the opportunity. When I was my connecting flight into Austin yesterday, the flight attendant said, thanks in advance for helping keep Austin weird. And I thought that was curious as a person who's never spent time here. But then I realized after kind of absorbing this morning and meeting Shoshana and hearing, I was like,
no, I'm weird.
She meant awesome. That's what she meant. It's like, no, I've really thoroughly enjoyed this. Yeah, thank you. So HomeStart as context was New England's first housing first philosophy homeless service provider. We provided housing search, permanently housed about 15,000 people living on streets and shelter in Boston, provide support, stabilization support for folks who have experienced chronic episodes of homelessness. In the early 2000s, we have these walk-in hours every week where anyone experiencing any level of housing instability can come in, and we can help triage or provide support for them. In the early 2000s, we had folks coming in and saying, can you provide housing search services for me because I know I'm going to be evicted in X number of days. Here's my eviction notice. And at the time, by virtue of the fact they had not yet become homeless, they didn't fit the parameters of who we were allowed to serve with our HUD contracts. And so at first, this was a trickle. And then within a few years in the early 2000s, it became a downpour. And so we went into housing court and started doing some research and learned that the average household becoming homeless by way of non-payment eviction was being evicted for a rental debt of $1,400, which was tiny compared to the spiral it was creating. We knew how much it cost to house a household after they were homeless, and this was significantly lower. So we incubated an eviction prevention program. And I'll elaborate on the elements of the program later, but what we learned was that 97% of our households 12 months after the intervention were stably housed. And 36 months after the intervention, only 5% of our households have been evicted for non-payment. We've prevented more than 5,000 evictions. But then we learned something very interesting. We worked with our close partners at the Boston Housing Authority, with their finance team and the resident services team for about a year, and learned that it was costing them over $10,000 to evict one family. But it was only costing HomeStart $2,000 to prevent that eviction from happening and supporting the family for an entire year. And so the Housing Authority came up to us and said, you guys saved us over $1 million last year alone. And at that point, we were like, okay, can you begin paying for it? and so that was sort of the initial revolution, is that they began paying HomeStart to prevent the evictions they were trying to execute, because the ROI was massive. The only problem with that was that the Boston Housing Authority was the only housing authority large enough in Massachusetts with the economies of scale to be able to pay the equivalent of a full-time employee. So we approached them and said, would you mind converting this into a per intervention reimbursement rate service, so that if you're a housing authority with 1 eviction a year or housing authority with 150 evictions a year, there would still be a positive return associated with that. And so in this last number of years, there's been this introduction of this. And as an aside, I mean, to your earlier point, is that in Boston, roughly 50% of all of the evictions are executed by 10 owners. Now, one of our advisory board members said, hey, I want you to spend some time with the principal of one of these large evictors. And so to share with the Renew Collaborative is how this program had been branded. And when we sat down, he had no idea how many folks in his portfolio they were evicting. Because like he said, like, there's never been an alternative to evicting a family, because we can't forgive rental debt or we'd go out of business, period. But we had been into housing court for the last number of years and knew exactly how many families he had evicted. And so I slid the paper across the table and I said, this is how many folks you've evicted. This is how much you spent on those evictions, because the cost structure is a little different for private institutional owners than the housing authority. And I said, this is how much you would have saved if you had introduced a Renew Collaborative into your service. And he was like, oh my goodness. And again, the savings was only a few $100,000, which was kind of a drop in the bucket. But it's like, for a person who cares about investments, it's like a basis point or something. It's not nothing. And so that then began a journey of introducing the service to private institutional owners and introducing this in context outside of Boston, replicating it in a few other markets, and are in conversations with some folks here in Texas to introduce the Renew Collaborative here.
Matt, that's really exciting, and that segues very nicely into the next question I have, which is, the critical need to, how critical it is to minimize evictions and to stabilize residents. And that matters, of course, to the tenants themselves, and it matters to the public sector, but it also matters to the private landlords, and it matters to nonprofit landlords in the community. Could you speak about, and this is kind of an invitation to all of you, why it matters and why it actually is critical to all of these actors to minimize evictions and stabilize renters? Do you want to go for that?
Sure. Yeah. I think these folks are very well suited to speak to the eviction piece. I'll talk a little bit about stabilization. Yeah. We strongly believe that local government's responsibility is to ensure the safety of one of its many responsibilities is to ensure the safety of its citizens, and we believe that a system in which housing codes are enforced is entirely complaint-based, is, as I mentioned before, implicitly and explicitly biased. There's a huge swath of the community that either doesn't have the wherewithal, the means, or quite frankly, is threatened to call the city about a housing issue. Our goal is to help enable and empower local governments to be more proactive about understanding where at-risk residents live. Data can shine a light on that. Because we thoroughly believe that households and families shouldn't have to make a decision between, on the one hand, living with infestation, living with mold, or on the other hand, homelessness. There is a middle ground, but it does take local governments to change the paradigm and empower citizens to understand their rights within housing.
Shoshana, why does it matter so much?
So I think when we think about stabilization, it's really important, and to, as Andrew was just saying, to think about stabilization not just as does the person stay in their home, but it's, well, in their home in the immediate, right? There's a question of how long, because a lot of our interventions are rental assistance, one check, and then it's 2 months later, right? So there's a how long, but there's also what's the quality of the housing that people are living in. And here in Austin and in Texas, because our landlord-tenant laws are so absurdly weak, it means that a lot of tenants are going from property to property to property in search of that property where their ceiling won't collapse. And there isn't permanency in their lives, and there isn't stability in their lives. Some of them, it may be that their landlord chooses to jack up their rent, like one of our tenant leaders was saying, $250 a month, and they can't afford it, so they search for the next place. But to me, stability is having the choice of whether or not you're staying in your home and being able to make that choice that you're living in a healthy and dignified home. And so that also means going into the property management office, of not experiencing trauma when you go into that office, not experiencing bullying when you go into that office. Because for a lot of evictions, and this is the data, which is the elusive data, right, in eviction circles, which is informal evictions, that for every formal eviction which is filed, more tenants leave when they get that notice to vacate. Or when the landlord says, hey, I'm gonna call ICE if you're not out tomorrow. Like, our team has talked to and seen families packing up frantic the night before the manager has said they're gonna call ICE, running out. That's not captured anywhere. And if we keep that person in that housing, is that stable? No. So really us thinking kind of not just a one-off, how are we, keeping that person there, but how are we getting a number of services, and how are we also shifting the culture of what it is to be a landlord. Personally, I'm not sure if the private sector can do that. I think regulation is needed and decommodification is needed. I know there are a lot of people in this room who believe that markets and capital can fix this problem. And so I challenge y'all to prove me wrong and to adopt some of these solutions yourself, right? And like, I will be very happy to be wrong there. But I think that when you have profit with housing, some of this is just a natural conclusion.
Matt, you've touched on this a little bit already, but will you elaborate a little on your experience around this?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm definitely preaching to the choir here. And we could probably spend hours just answering this one question. I mean, you could just even the first point. I mean, the eviction epidemic is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, racial justice issue of our time. Like, that alone, we could spend weeks just discussing the implications of that. If you're a single black mother, you are 2 times more likely to be evicted than if you're a single white mother, all else being equal. The eviction epidemic has had the same impact in the black community for black women that mass incarceration has had with black men over the last 40 years. And so to say that the implications of addressing this issue is not like just absolutely tragic, and if it doesn't sort of awaken some sort of moral obligation to respond, like, I don't know what else is. So that being said, like a more like granular answer to your question is that, I feel like one of the reasons that this program I've described works so well is that this is not a story of heroes and villains. I mean, this is a very easy topic to sort of demonize various stakeholders in the process. I mean, I know a lot of landlords who twist themselves into pretzels trying to support folks. In fact, some of the owners who are most progressive twist themselves most into pretzels, have rental rearages jacked so high up that the mountain is so big, there's no intervention that can support the resident after they're in that situation. And so it's like identifying like what are the incentives for every stakeholder. And I do feel like this is an area where, It isn't. I was talking to owner of, I think, the 4th largest property manager of affordable housing in the country, and he was like, I know the internal rate of return is there, but the reason I'd institute this is because evictions are terrible on the culture of our organization. It is miserable. Like 100 wonderful things can happen in the lives of our resident service coordinators. If they have to facilitate a forcible move out, it's like their lives are miserable, like the emotional weight. And so I would do, not just to strengthen the community, not just to strengthen the return of our investors, but just the quality of life of our employees. That's why I would institute something like this. So again, like we could talk for a long time, but it affects everyone. And if you're a taxpayer and you don't think this this affects you, you are wrong. Because the downstream impact of this on the healthcare system, the education system, all of that is just profound. And so let's not pretend that it doesn't affect all of us.
Yeah. Andrew, I have a question for you. How do registries work? And how do data collection practices, walk us through some experiences you've had with cities that have been able to implement these sort of practices and what the results have been.
Sure, yeah, and I think it's important to differentiate between the formal policies and then practices of just tracking data on the rental community. So in terms of policies, right, you put under this broad blanket of rental registries, but that can include rental licensing, rental registries, rental inspection programs. Basically, it's a system that a local government or a state government can put in place to license rental properties and or license rental owners like they would any other business, right? I did a little bit of Googling. Does anybody know how many hours of professional training you need to become a Class A barber in the state of Texas? 1,000. You need to go through 1,000 hours of professional training through a licensed institution to cut hair as a Class A barber in Massachusetts, in Texas. And the fundamental truth is that in most communities, it requires 0 hours of training to be a landlord. And I've gotten a bad haircut. We've all gotten bad haircuts. They tend to work themselves out after about a month, right? Versus the long-term health implications of living in a substandard property, or the mental anguish of living sort of with that guillotine always held over your head if you have a threatening landlord. And so these programs are basically set up to, as I said, at a minimum, just get basic contact information from landlords, right? Say, if you're operating a rental property, we need to have a local point of contact, because if something goes wrong, if there's a water main break, if a tenant complains, we need to know who to contact. All the way up the line to, like I said, licensing programs, licensing regimes whereby if a landlord doesn't meet minimum standards, that license can get revoked, and you can therefore not operate a rental business in a community. And then the more progressive programs are really around rental inspection programs, where you are required to undergo a baseline inspection on a regular basis, and that can be on a sliding scale. We can talk a little bit about that, some of those more progressive regimes. But just to ensure safe and stable housing, much like I can go into any restaurant in Austin and they're required to post somewhere their health grade, is it A, B, C, or D? The fact is, again, that doesn't exist for most rental properties around the country, and that has a far greater impact on the health and safety and well-being of residents. But also, you've got sort of the practices that can be put in place. I know that it's a heavy lift to get some of these policies put in place, but again, data can be a great arbiter here, and there is data that allows communities to better understand their rental housing community, who is acquiring properties, who is operating properties in their community, right? You're hard-pressed to come across a city council that isn't starting to at least ask questions about institutional investors, single-family rentals. Are these folks coming into my community? What is the impact on rental prices? And most of the time, the folks, the administrators, the staffers are sort of like, I don't really know. And it's because there is a huge asymmetry in terms of the data that some of these large institutional investors and landlords have versus what cities have. We think that asymmetry can be solved because local governments are awash in data. There's a ton of data out there. It's tough to wrangle, but there's a ton of data that local governments have access to, right? They don't have access to the insights, right? Because that takes a capacity which sometimes doesn't exist within local government. They have access to, there is data out there that can allow them to better understand like who owns properties. Are we talking about large landlords? Are we talking about small landlords? Who is perpetuating the eviction crisis in our community? And so that's that sort of like those practices that can be put in place to allow communities to better understand the rental housing market.
Yeah, and we have no idea in terms of our not no idea, but single data on our single family rental stock is non-existent. You have to kind of piece it together. And just that simple something which is really a baseline to be like, how are we confronting this crisis? We don't even have that knowledge.
And it's a burr in the saddle of housing advocates. It's a burr in the saddle of code enforcement. If you talk to any code enforcement office in any city, they'll say these LLCs, it's impossible for me to trace who's the beneficial owner is. Like, there are some modern tools with data science where you can actually start piecing these things together and understand who owns what is the beneficial owner, who's the beneficial owner of these properties, to really understand, like I said, separate the good, which is the vast majority of folks, from the bad, which is a very, very small sliver.
You know, it's interesting. We've had some recent climate emergency and disaster situations in our community, including a winter freeze a few years back. And we had a really hard time even getting basic resources to folks for lack of this kind of data that we could have had access to, and it would have directly impacted many lives. Matt, I want to skip to you real quick and just ask you, you had promised to tell us a little bit more about HomeStart and kind of break down a little bit more of the eviction prevention program for us.
Sure. So the program is really simple. We meet a family in court. We make a small payment to the property owner to stop the eviction and buy some time. We work with the family to identify all the drivers associated, like that precipitated their eviction situation, and create with them a blueprint to mitigate against the risk of those incidences happening again. And then we work with the family for 12 months while they repay to the owner the balance of their debt, and the owner is made whole. And so, again, one of the reasons the program has such a high success rate is because the experts, i.e. the residents, are integrally involved in developing that blueprint. They just need a little bit of support. So is that that's the bare minimum sort of nuts and bolts of the program?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And you know, I kind of want to pivot to another aspect of the conversation. I'd love to hear from all of y'all, but Shoshana, I think, you know, from some of the work that has been done on the ground, there's a side to this conversation that has really begun to surface a lot, which is this issue around fines and fees, and many of these fees that sort of surface up in folks' lives. And when we talk about stabilizing folks and, you know, preventing things that might eventually lead to an eviction process, Shoshana, tell us a little bit more about the role that fines and fees play in household incomes.
Yeah, so this is an issue we've been seeing more and more over the past few years, which is disaggregating what used to be a service and rent into, or decoupling that service into its own fee. So kind of like we pay, you know, extra for our baggage in the airplane. So now there's fees for valet trash, there's fees for administration, there's fees for facilities, which is just using your common areas. There's fees, I saw one the other day, which was a fire hydrant fee, right? And so like, what's next, an air fee? And so we're seeing these fees crop up, and UT School of Law, a clinic, their housing policy clinic led by Heather Way, it did some research on this for us last semester, and they're gonna be putting out a report next week. Again, we have a sneak peek, which is on their website, which will be up on that QR code there. And this really lays out both the problems which we're seeing on fees, and then also what are some potential solutions to the fees that we're seeing. One of the fees we see is actually an eviction prevention fee. So you're behind on rent, you're able to repay your rent, you pay all the late fees associated with rent, and then you got to pay another fee in order to not be evicted, right? And so that obviously directly contributes to our eviction crisis. Another aspect of fees, so I think that there's an issue of disclosure that we see a lot of tenants who they sign up and they're like, oh, this is $1,200, I can handle that, right? And then their first bill comes in and it's $1,400, $1,500. We're working with the Altura Tenants Association right now, which Taheen is the lead organizer on. And this has been an ongoing issue, $200 to $300 of additional fees, which tenants didn't know about. And we were in a negotiation with those owners and said, why can't you just put that in rent? Just say the rent is $1,500. And they were like, no, we disclose it. They know what they're signing. And we pressed more and more, why can't you put it in rent? And they said, well, if we put it in rent, no, we wouldn't get any tenants because they would go down the block to places which have fees. And we're like, yes, you're duping tenants, right? Like that this is part of the larger housing market. It's not like one person is, one landlord saying, oh, I'm doing this, but it's as soon as they all start doing it, then they're all doing it. It also obscures affordability data that we have. There have been all these stories recently about rents are falling in Austin, and I think some of that is that rents don't have fees with them, right? And so what does that look like? So there's some regulation related to disclosure. There can be regulation saying that all fees have to be included in rent. But I think this is going to be a kind of upcoming area. I'd be interested nationally in terms of Andrew and Boston if this is something that you guys are seeing and dealing with.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a good example. In Cincinnati, the city actually took one of the large SFR operators to court and sued them because they were including in their lease terms maintenance fees. Right, so effectively, they own the property, they're extracting rent from the tenant, they should be maintaining that property. And so the city said the fact that you're charging maintenance fees is effectively abdicating responsibility for maintaining your properties and ensuring they're up to code. So this gets back to the aggressive city solicitor legal department fee. So one of the things that the folks in Cincinnati did is they basically, once they had an understanding of who owned property and who are the large property owners, they basically went out in the community and tried to get their hands on leases to understand, hey, what are the lease terms and are there ways that we can start turning the screws a little bit if these folks are turning the screws on our tenants?
Well, now, Andrew, since you said that, there is a concern that some of these practices around data collection and the licensing and the registry that you mentioned earlier place an undue burden on landlords. Talk to us a little bit about that. Do you think that that's the case? Is there a different way of thinking about this?
Yeah, and any conversation about any sort of oversight, any sort of policies or practices that are addressing rental housing, they have to include the landlord community, right? They absolutely have to. They have to be involved from day one in the scoping and shaping of these discussions. There's a great example, the city of Rochester, which has been running a proactive rental inspection program since the 80s. They made a decision about 5 or 6 years ago to say, hey, like we're going to move forward with a public-facing property manager and rental owner score. Right, basically think about this as like the equivalent of that restaurant health grade or like a Yelp for landlords. And this is going to be a community asset because I, as a renter, should be able to look up and understand, hey, does this owner, not just what are the conditions of this property, because I can go look at the property and see that, but like does the management company, what kind of practices do they implement? From the moment they decided to do this, it took them 3.5 years to roll this out. I'm not saying they dragged their feet, but it's because they engaged the landlord community throughout the entire process. So they would raise issues with the score, and the city would address them directly. I mean, one of them was, you're going to curb us from acquiring substandard properties and bringing them up to code. They said that's a totally valid concern. From the time you acquire a property, you have a year-long reprieve, but that property is not going to be scored as part of your portfolio. If you pull a building permit, that's going to basically buy you another 6 to 8 months, right? And so part of it is just engaging them in the process, and part of it is designing programs that, as I said, are intended to squeeze the small sliver of bad actors out there, but also reward the good actors. So places like Minneapolis and Brooklyn Center, which is a small community outside of Minneapolis, they have progressive rental inspection programs whereby all landlords are required to have their properties inspected. When it's inspected, if you have a clean bill of health, guess what? The city's not coming back to see you for 8 years. 8 years you have a run, right? Obviously you have to track and see if they sell the property and get back in there with the new owner. But if they find a violation in the first inspection, they're going to come out and see, obviously they're going to follow that up to make sure that the property is brought up to code, but then they're going to come out with another proactive inspection at 6 months. And then there's a sliding scale based on the landlord behavior. So there are ways to design these programs both with sticks but also carrots for the landlords. There's also a number of tools that can be implemented that are, that like landlords really like, right? So you say, look, we're going to track your property conditions. We're also going to alert you if we receive a complaint about your property so you can get out there and fix a violation before we get out there, right? So landlords be able to sign up for alerts on their properties to know, hey, are we getting like nuisance calls for loud parties on your property? Are we seeing complaints for your property condition, to give you an opportunity to get out there and respond to that before we have to go out there, cite you, and fine you?
Well, that's great. Thinking about this sort of theme around partnerships and collaboration, Matt, the work that you guys have done around the creation of the Community Housing Assistance Fund, my understanding is that you were able to bring together banks, realtors, businesses, and individuals that helped finance that. Will you talk a little bit about what that process was of bringing those actors together and what the fund does?
Sure. So as an aside, I think I missed your cue earlier to sort of
sorry.
elaborate on the program. And so do you mind if I just
please
answer your earlier question? I
Yeah.
give you the 3-sentence rather
Take
than
your
the
time.
2-paragraph. Right. So as a quick aside, in Boston, pre-pandemic, there were roughly 5,000 evictions a year. About 2/3 of those, counterintuitively, were for households who had subsidies. And again, most of the evictions, 80% in Boston, are non-payment as opposed to cause evictions, a violation of their lease, something of that sort. And so just to be super clear, the Renew Collaborative is how this program is branded, is not designed to prevent every kind of issue. We work exclusively in non-payment situations, and there's a few qualifications for the program. One is the household needs to be at 80% AMI or below. 95% of our households are 30% AMI or below. It has to be a non-payment exclusively situation as opposed to cause. The rental arrearage cannot extend above a certain amount, and that amount has adjusted a little bit post-pandemic because they account, the arrearages for most owners is like massively higher than it was pre-pandemic. And so in Boston, the AR for most institutional owners is 8 times as high as it was before the pandemic, and that's pretty good relative to a lot of other markets in the country. The household has to be willing to work with us for 12 months, and that's like a key element, is that most of the folks who participate will, because we're a neutral third party, and the only objective we have is making certain they are never evicted, never become homeless, they will disclose things to us that they wouldn't their owner, because they feel like the landlord might use that information to sort of it might compromise or jeopardize their tenancy. So my uncle is coming every weekend, he's abusing us, he's taking our money, et cetera, and that's why I can't. So they will tell us that. And so in that situation, we will introduce a representative payee service, and so that money never ends up in their bank account. So it's just like paying rent, completely mitigate the risk of that bad actor negatively affecting the family situation. But because we work with a household for 12 months, regardless of when their eviction incident surfaces, we can introduce them to community resources that they can maintain in perpetuity, like back to school costs, holiday gifts, at the end of the winter, utility arrearage payments, less expensive childcare at the end of the school year, things of that sort. Also, as an aside, the way we've designed the reimbursement rate contract with the owners will pay 75% of the agreed upon amount upon engagement, and then 12 months after the engagement starts, they will pay the balance of that amount to us. So that reduces the owner's risk that they're paying for something that's not going to work. We know that that's a very low risk because almost all of our families succeed in this program. But it also allows us to have a very good way to track the data out in the outcomes of our households, because as you know, that's expensive. But the data that we get from the owners is really good because they do not want to pay a dime on the service if they don't have to. And so we have a good sort of way to monitor that. So anyways, that's an aside. And if anyone, again, the whole objective is not for HomeStart to sort of plant a flag in a community. It's identify the resources in that community and open source it and make whatever we have available to whoever wants it. I am certain, the default perspective is there are things happening in Austin that are way better than are happening in Boston, way, way better. And there's enough distinctives unique to any market that it's the impulse is to go listen, understand assets, and then to give whatever we can to help you all do what you need to do. So anyways, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Circling back.
Yeah. And, we're almost at time, and I want to have time to take at least 1 or 2 questions from the audience. By the way, anyone who's using the HOVA app, feel free to drop questions in here, and we'll try to get at least 1 or 2 questions in. But I do want to circle back to Shoshana real quick. I know we're not going to have time to get into a super in-depth answer here, but talk to us a little bit about what an effective rental assistance program could look like, and how can we best ensure that we're using the very limited resources that we have locally to serve tenants?
So I'll be quick, especially because of time, and I think that a lot of what has already been talked about, and when you're talking about programs like HomeStart, right, like if you have a robust program in place in which then you're leveraging rental assistance dollars with more services, that's going to go farther. There's also a question of, if you're talking about emergency rental assistance, if we're basically using that as an anti-poverty measure because housing is expensive and incomes aren't increasing at the levels of AMI, then why don't we just do universal guaranteed income, right? Why are we like lining landlord pockets at the same time? That's like being very careful. The policymakers should be just intentional about what they are trying to do. I think if you're talking about housing stability, it's how you are leveraging dollars with other services. Here in Austin, the city and county both put some rental assistance dollars into programs that Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, which BASTA is a project of, and volunteer legal services can tap into to be able to help negotiate settlements, right? And then you know that what's being paid is actually owed. So I think there are some creative programs there. And then the final one I would say would be long-term voucher assistance, especially in low-income housing, tax credit housing, because what we're seeing and what some of the tenant leaders were speaking about in the video, they live in tax credit housing. But AMIs are going up like this, area median incomes are going up like this, and fixed incomes for seniors are going like this. So quote unquote affordable housing isn't affordable, and so how are we having long-term stability so that seniors in our community can stay?
Well, I'm gonna knock a bottle off the table. I'm gonna put out a big last closing question, and this is kind of for everybody. Thinking about the funding, public funding sources, how do local jurisdictions leverage the use of public funding for creating affordable housing to enact eviction prevention strategies and stabilize tenants? How do we leverage the public dollars that we have? I think we've touched on this in various ways already, but if we're kind of wrapping it up big picture, what would your message be?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like earlier today we've gotten a lot of really concrete, good ideas of things that can be done. I'll just give you one little one, and this is to emphasize how like little p, administrative policy change, is just as important as big P, kind of legislative policy change. And so our chief of housing in Boston read Evicted. She was infuriated. We sat down, she was like, what can we do to address this issue? And so like in brainstorming, most of the evictors are also the developers. And so she, not HomeStart, but she decided to include one question on the funding application for people who are trying to develop in the city, and that is how many evictions took place in your portfolio last year, blank. And then in one fell swoop, every single owner had to know the answer to that question. And then the next year, she added one question just below that on the funding applications. What interventions are you instituting to reduce that number? Blank. And then every single owner who are these evictors had to develop a strategy. And that, like in that, a lot happened. Like for instance, the largest evictor in the city decided to change the incentives of the attorneys they had outsourced all the evictions. Historically, the attorneys who manage these evictions are incentivized on the amount of folks that they can evict. And they flip the incentives on its head. The owner did this and say, attorney, now you're going to be held accountable for how many of these tenancies you preserve. Like, are you attorneys accessing the community resources? Like, those two little changes will affect way more households than an intervention like ours. And so that's one way that a policymaker, an administrator can make some pretty radical change.
Shoshana, any thoughts on the matter?
I think piggybacking on that, it's not just it's what can be attached to the public funds, right? If you're using public funds and you're investing in housing, then how are you making sure that it's going to good actors, or you're using this as an opportunity to change the practices and behaviors of landlords? So in Austin, we have the standard tenant protections for our rental housing development assistance programs. Those aren't used in all programs, right? That's a lot of public funds is going into units on the ground. And oftentimes when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking in units, not talking what happens, what's the experience of tenants in those units, right? So I think that there's an opportunity for tacking on when we're investing, when we're using public funds to invest in that housing, of exactly what you were saying, which is how are we making sure that the folks who we are investing in are treating tenants well, and also how are we using that money to invest in decommodified structures, right? Not just, and it could be an assortment, but how are we experimenting with other housing ownership types in a way which can create long-term, sustainable, stable communities?
Yeah, we focus a lot on sort of optimization, right, of the funds that are going out there, right? So most of the larger communities we work with have demolition diversion funds, they have rehab grants, they have homeowner support or small landlord support funds. The typical model is basically put that up on a city website and say, hey, come talk to us if you need some help. The optimization of those funds is really identifying, first, what are the neighborhoods where we're seeing the early warning signs of sort of things flipping, like tracking things like when properties go from homeowner-owned to investor-owned, right? When you see some of the large investors start to invest in one neighborhood, right, their model is to sort of swarm so they can start to exercise some control over rents, right? So when you see that first large landlord dip their toe into a new neighborhood, that's the place that needs help. And then you can use data to say, okay, well, like, let me find my small-scale landlords. Let me find my small-scale landlords who haven't invested in their properties, right? Building permits, cities have access to that. Let me find those small-scale landlords who haven't invested in their properties in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, or the more acute signals, let me track pre-foreclosure filings. And so direct those dollars at the neighborhoods where you can have the greatest impact, right? Where things are at a tipping point and you can tip them back, and then find the specific owners' properties where you can direct those dollars to really optimize the use of them.
Well, I thank you all for this brilliant, solution-focused, partnership-focused conversation. We could sit here probably for another couple hours. I have a dozen more questions to ask, but we are at time. And thank you all for joining us, and look forward to continuing to develop these solutions locally. Thank you all.